and welcome to the Real Biz Life Chronicles, where we discuss all things business, branding, and life. I'm your host, Tracy Fryer. Now, my guest today, he lets courage and purpose drive his decisions. I had the privilege of seeing this person present at a leadership conference in Frio a few months ago, and I was so inspired by the confidence that he has in his life's purpose. He was selected as a leader for a team of 24 for an expedition to Antarctica that was supposed to last a year, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, lasted 537 days. He is a keynote speaker who commands your attention when he presents. He is the author of 537 Days of Winter, and today he's here to share his story and teach us all that he knows about leadership, resilience, and endurance. David Knoff, welcome.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks for having me on, and good day to all the listeners out there.
Yes, thank you so much for making time for us, David. David, I'd love to know, how is it that you found yourself as a leader, for a team of 24 on the way to Antarctica? Had you always wanted to be an explorer of some way growing up?
Yeah, growing up, I probably didn't think I'd end up, being an Antarctic expedition leader. It wasn't. It's probably not a job that you even know about. I guess a number of people involved in Antarctic research, they probably had parents or a parent or an uncle or someone that might have been to Antarctica on a trip, and maybe that sows the seed. But I had none of that in my background growing up. It wasn't until in later life, in a couple of my other careers, I'd met a few people that had been to Antarctica and worked down there, and always had this fascination with travel and adventure. And it's the ultimate location and the ultimate, like the final frontier and last wilderness on Earth. And so it had sort of taken a number of years of just weaving my career in different directions, and we can get into all of that later of how I ended up there exactly. But it was then this professional goal of like, okay, you know what I want to be? I'd always enjoy leadership and the challenges that brings. But then I realized that, hang on a minute, the last place on earth and the last bastion of true leadership, where management's one thing and leadership's a complete other, when you've got to live and work with your team for days, weeks, months, and years on end, is Antarctica. And there's other places out there with similar challenges, but I saw Antarctica as like, that's the pinnacle of that style of leadership that I endeavored to get towards, and had the chance in 2020 to head down there and lead a team of just 24 people for what became a very interesting year and a bit.
Yes, as I have heard, perhaps for our listeners, David, you could please share a bit about that story.
Yeah, so in 2019, there was 24 of us who'd signed up to be the wintering team at one of Australia's 3 permanent stations in Antarctica, called Davis Station. In the summertime, it's got around 100 people and about a 50-50 split of sort of scientific researchers and then operational support staff. But that drops down to just 24 people in the winter to run it through the winter, the darkness and bitter cold of an Antarctic winter, to kind of keep the lights on and keep the place running and set it up again for the next summer and all the scientists come back. Now, we set sail in late October 2019 on one of the final voyages of Australia's old icebreaker, the RSV Aurora Australis. And there was this plan that we'd come home a year later on the maiden voyage of the new icebreaker, a kind of old meets new, with the old ship being decommissioned in that time and then the new one completing its sea trials and coming to pick us up. But as we rolled into 2020 and the last ship, the ship came back, picked up all the scientists and left the 24 of us there, we started to hear about the pandemic. This is around March 2020. We're like, look, we're probably better off. We'll just stay here. It's fine. No big deal. And no one really thought much of it initially. If you remember back to those early days of 2020, there was a naivety that, okay,
there was.
We'll get through. There'll be it's just a 2-week lockdown. Don't worry about it. And so we were in the same boat of like, all right, well, we'll just ride this out. What a perfect year to do our Antarctic winter, and we'll go home in November on the new ship. All good. But by the time it got to mid 2020, the whole thing changed, and we were told, hey, the old ship's out of commission. You can't get that. The new ship, the dockyard where they're building it, has completely shut down. They can't do its sea trials. It can't come and get you. There's no ships. We can fly to Antarctica in the modern age, but that was off the table as well due to a few other operational factors, but mainly the pandemic had impacted the ability to get the planes down there. So that was off, and then we couldn't use international partners. And so they came to this conclusion of like, despite all the redundancies and all the different operational options and logistic chains to get people to and from Antarctica in the modern era, the best thing to do was actually just leave us there an additional 6 months, at least, potentially even longer, because that was the safest thing to do. And whilst technically it was fine, we had enough food and fuel and supplies to get through that. And they supply the stations, and there's a lot of contingency food and things around the stations for these sorts of things, but it just hadn't happened in the modern age. And we live in a world
No.
now where you click your heels and you get to go home, or you know, things go your way. And
Yeah.
everyone learned in 2020 that we're not as in control of our lives or destinies as we thought we were. But for us, we were now stuck staring down the barrel of a far lengthier expedition than we'd originally planned. And the human side of that became the real challenge for every member of the team. It didn't matter if you were a station leader like myself or any member of the team had now this big kind of dark cloud over the head of like, well, when are we going home? How are we even getting home? And what on earth is home going to look like when we eventually get there? And it really threw a spanner in the works. And you know, so to everyone's credit, like the team really rose to the occasion, and I was surrounded by a great team, which helped a lot. But it didn't mean we weren't also internally and externally struggling with the realities of the situation.
And so much uncertainty as well.
That's right. And that became one of the key aspects of the whole ordeal was how do you face uncertainty and what you can't control? And one of the key mental health aspects and training things we'd use is what they call the kind of the sphere of control, where, you know, focus on things you can control, and that which you can't control, choose how you face it, or choose your attitude. And it's almost a good attitude readjustment tool. If you might sit there and go, oh, but why can't we do this? Or what about that? Or why aren't they trying this? Or why can't we use the Japanese ship? Or why aren't we doing this other thing? And you kind of go, none of that's inside your control. Control your attitude. And for us, we had the benefit of being part of, 100 years and even longer of Antarctic exploration and history to go, well, Antarctica has always had that vibe. If you set off into the unknown and on a wooden ship 100 years ago, these days on a modern iceberg, it's always had that element of unknown. So having that link, I think, helped most of us get through it to go, well, this is now just a modern Antarctic story of something ridiculous happening. And we had that link to kind of help you go, oh, we now join a very elite club of those that have had sort of pretty perilous scenarios play out during their time in Antarctica. And any year down there is a tough ordeal as it is. Ours just sort of went to turbo towards the end as well.
So, David, walk us through. I'd love to, because I remember when you presented, you mentioned that you were, I think, having a Zoom with your boss, and you kind of just said, well, you guys have to stay there. As a leader, knowing you have to kind of deal with that like mountain moving forward, what went through your mind?
Yeah, that was a particularly tough moment. I still remember it very clear. It was a video call, like I'm sure everyone's had, and he'd been a station leader himself, and he was then the operations manager for the Australian Antarctic program, and he just laid out the facts. And it's very important when you are delivering kind of bad news that you don't beat around the bush. You just go, yep, well, here are the facts. This is where, and the background of that decision, not just, hey, you're all staying another 6 months, or, have fun.
Deal with it.
He'd gone through, and then kind of just passed the baton to me to say, well, now here's the realities of it all. Here's the situation. You're going to have to go and brief the team on this. And there was no easy way to do that. What I did straight away was sort of finish that call and take a moment to think, okay, what do I personally think about this? Didn't really even factor into it. I didn't have time to worry about my own feelings at that point. They came into it later. It was kind of like, okay, how do I A, break the news to everyone, and then B, what's this really going to do to the team? And went and spoke to my deputy station leader, who she was she had a lot more Antarctic experience than I did. She was the wintering chef, and so I went and had a chat to her and said, hey, this is the reality. And most of us probably knew it was coming anyway. We'd seen the writing on the wall with a few other factors, but it's still important, no matter what the rumor mill was or the fact that it was almost an obvious decision that was coming. Gathered everyone together that night and just ripped the Band-Aid off and went through, hey, these are the realities. We're all staying a bit longer, but we can now take ownership of it. And that had been an important discussion I'd had with some of the psychs and others around, okay, well, you've sort of taken something from us with being our freedom and our ability to return as planned. How do we take ownership of this situation and some group buy-in and equity in the scenario, which really didn't change too much because there was so many realities of just, well, we've got to keep doing what we're doing to keep the place running and keep ourselves alive and sustained. So what we could change was some of the work-life balance, some of the routines, adapt them. If they were set, it's almost like if you were running a marathon and you go, okay, I've got to run 6-minute Ks and that'll get me to my
Yeah.
time, and any difference on that is going to change my goal time, whatever it is.
I
But
can
then
relate
someone
to
says,
that.
and someone goes, oh, hey, by the way, you've got to run. You're now running 50Ks. You go, okay. You'd quickly do the maths in your head and go, that's all right. If I drop to 6:30s, I can do that. That'll drop my heart rate back down. And so we sort of made those assessments and those changes to go, okay, well, how do we worked sort of 6 days, or we basically worked 7 days, but you notionally had a day off. We tried to peel that back, and we tried like 5 days and a half, and then we moved things around. And honestly, most of those things, they didn't solve the problem, but they just made another month disappear. And you can go, great, we haven't fixed the problem, but we're a month closer to the end. And I'd learned a lot about what they call kind of wicked problems and chaotic situations where there isn't a solution. And it's a hard one to let go of as a leader or as a manager or a boss, that there isn't a fix. And I'd always had the sort of personality and drive to fix things. Yet in this scenario, the only fix was, okay, everyone needs to go home, but that's just not going to happen. And you just had to go, right, all we do now is find ways to just recalibrate it where we can, point it in the right direction, steer the course, because it's going to get fairly ugly at points, individually and collectively. But embracing that chaos and understanding that there is no solution, but the solution is to just keep going and keep trying to find ways to move forward, and having a blindly positive attitude in leadership does help as well.
Yeah. And how have you cultivated that? Because, I think what you said earlier, like you had to put your personal feelings aside, which I think a lot of business owners struggle with, because we are human at the end of the day. How did you do that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that was then my background going into it. I had two major careers, one in uniform in the military, and then with foreign affairs and trade. And I'd always had a focus on where you put the mission or the team and the goals first. And I'd never come from jobs where the hours really mattered. And that was something where you go, it's an all-in kind of job. Station leader, voyage leader, CEO, parent, whatever it is. There's a lot of 24-hour, 7-day-a-week jobs out there. And Antarctica is one of those, despite the fact that, you are contracted and paid in different ways, depending on your role and your job. It's a job that 24 hours a day, you're it. So if something something within your lane comes up, you're dealing with it. And I think in ways that helped me keep that separate of just, well, we're in this. I signed up to this scenario. I wanted to be a leader, and I wanted to come down here. This is the hand we've been dealt. That was what you chose this. And one of the things I talk a lot about in my talks is around resilience as a choice. And it can sound funny, you go, but you do choose. You make a decision of whether or not you're motivated enough or committed enough to do that particular thing you've set out to do, or you choose to fail or give up. And now failure is sometimes an option depending on what it is. And in terms of, okay, do we abort what we're trying to do this particular day and try again with the lessons we can learn out of failing? And I often say, you fail fast, fail often, you'll learn a lot more from failure than you will success. But in this scenario, it was a case of, well, we're all in this together. We're all in the same boat here. We need to find a way to, we chose this. This is what we've been given, and roll through. And the team really just rose to that. There were times we'd have to remind people of, well, this is why we're doing something, or linking it back to that. Well, yeah, it might seem like a menial task that you're doing right now, but if we don't do that, then this doesn't function, and then we can't survive. So you're welcome to not do your job properly. And that could be, it was often on simple things like cleaning up around the station, because there's no maids or cleaners or anything. Once a week, you'd have a roster of, hey, you're cleaning the gym this week, or you're on kitchen duty, or you're on taking out the rubbish, or whatever it is. And occasionally people would slack on that. And it was hilarious, because you go, well, straight away, and it wouldn't even necessarily be me, you didn't need the station leader to step in. Someone would say, oh, the bins haven't been taken out. And taking the bins out in Australia, it's pretty straightforward. You take them out. You can be in pajamas or board shorts, whatever. You're fine.
Always.
It's hard. If it's minus 40 degrees and 100 knots of wind, taking the bins out is pretty tricky. So there'd be days where we wouldn't do it, because you're like, okay, just leave all the rubbish where it is, and we'll take it to the dumpsters. And then those dumpsters, there's like very clear processes of what goes back to Australia, what gets incinerated, what gets recycled, what gets reused. It's very, very structured. But yes, someone could, if that hadn't been done, someone would just go to the roster and be like, "Oi, Tracy, you're on bin duty, and the bins haven't been done. Like, what the hell?" And
that probably would be me.
exactly. And so that stuff was sort of funny that you didn't have to be the policeman as often as some people would assume you might have to be, because the community would self-police that stuff. And if then, say, you haven't taken the bins out and you've given them a lot of attitude, then it would come to me and say, "Hey, Tracy didn't take the bins out and she gave me attitude. What's her problem?" And 99% of the time, the problem would always loop back to the fact of like, well, the problem is that we're stuck here longer than we're supposed to be and everyone's sick of it. And then you'd have to kind of unpack that and work out what was going on. And that often became, that became a much bigger percentage of my time later in the piece rather than early on in the first half of the year. You rarely having to deal with any of those sorts of issues towards not necessarily the end, but that period in the middle, probably around the 1 year anniversary and the run up to Christmas. So you're really in the third quarter of the whole trip was when everyone was just sick of it. The end wasn't in sight.
Yeah.
We'd been there for over a year. There just didn't seem to be much hope. It was still at the tail end of the Antarctic winter, so it's cold, it's dark. A lot of the jobs we were having to do were repetitive or jobs we'd done a year earlier. And those were the times when you've got to try and find a link or a motivating factor in each person or your team to keep them focused on, yep, I know this sucks, but we've got to do it. And you chose to be here. We're all part of this together. Let me help you, or I'll get you some more help, or what do you need to find a way to do that? But you've got to find a way to do it.
And did you find there was anyone in your team that kind of wanted to tap out? Because I know, like, as business owners, sometimes you might, remind people of the mission and what it is that we're doing, and there'll be a couple that say, "Nah, it's not for me." Was there anyone on your team that did that?
I feel like you already know the answer to that one. Yes.
For
the listeners out there, for those that haven't read my book or seen anything, so that did happen, and that happened in that phase. So around 2/3 of the way through, sort of just prior to Christmas 2020. One member of the team, and it's slightly changed the way it's told in the book and the way I tell it live. Changes a few little elements just to protect some elements of the story,
of course,
and the individual. But one member of the team marched into my office and just said, "Hey, I've had enough of this. I've had enough of you. I've had enough of everyone. I've had enough of this whole scenario. Stuff you, stuff the team." Stuff the government. I'm done. I quit. I don't want to do this anymore. And I mean, it was hilarious because you're sitting there in the middle of Antarctica. You got no way. You got nowhere to go home. There is no way out. If there was a way out, we would have given it to him. And it was this scenario where I'm like, "Well, far out, mate. Like, what? Like, you can't quit." And he's like, "Well, I do," and stormed out. And it was pretty and I think that was one time where my own personal thoughts and my own emotions actually got in the way, and I hadn't up until that point. I probably hadn't cracked, and yet as a leader, I feel like I absolutely did in that moment, and just went like, I don't know what to do here. I've lost it. There is no fix. I've got no solution. This whole thing's falling apart. He's quitting. That means there's going to be another quitter tomorrow, and then the whole team's going to fracture. And this is just ridiculous. And what the hell do I do? And because part of me is like, you can't quit. To me, it was not an option. And
of course.
I think the chapter of that in the book is called "Quitting is Not an Option." And so that was this thing of like, and then I remember so I did what anyone would do in that scenario and called the HR manager at the Antarctic division back in Australia. So he's comfortably sitting there with his latte in Hobart, and which was strangely unaffected by the pandemic at this point as well. So they were kind of fine.
Okay.
I remember I did one Zoom meeting and they were all at the pub in Tassie, and I'm like,
"Oh my goodness,
thanks,
that would have been tough."
That was hard. But so and he's just like, "Look, this happens occasionally. It happens every now and then. Give it a bit of space, calm yourself down, give him some time and some distance from yourself and his own direct manager, and then reset the relationship and try and work out a way to get him back to work, because he's like, essentially, you being the team and him need to come up with a plan." And We then had this sort of 4 or 5 prong approach where it was between myself, the one doctor on the station, the deputy station leader, this bloke's kind of team leader, and then the rest of the community to work around it and go, okay, well, how do we now get him back in the fold? And we didn't, and it was a case as well. You can't just fold over and go, well, let's just do everything he says. You go, well,
Yeah,
it's not
precisely.
going to work either. So I sat down with him a few days later, and a number of others had in the lead up to this as well, and sat down, went through everything, went through the kind of key requirements of what has to happen around the station, gave him some more choice. So gave him more control was a big part of it. Gave him more control over his role on station and his reporting lines, and changed a bit of that to get him back to work. And we got him back in a sort of odd job role, which was vitally important for the station, and gave him that autonomy. It meant that he was part of a team of 4 that then went one man down, but they were able to kind of deal with that, and we were kind of more efficient at times, I felt, without having that. And so it created all these funny little dynamics, but essentially you go, right, at the end of the day, you go, okay, this was not ideal. This isn't what anyone wanted.
Yeah.
But if everyone's now functionally back at work and pulling their weight, we're good. And that we moved on from there. And it was a tough moment. I look back, and retrospectively, there were like moments earlier where you kind of go, oh, if I'd done this then maybe this would have happened, or if I'd been more aware of this. And I don't know. It's a hard one for me to rationalize. I felt at times that was my lowest point as an individual and as a leader, to be like, oh, one member of the team quit. Yeah. But I did get a lot of solace out of the fact that that wasn't the first time, and it happened to Shackleton like 100 years ago. The ultimate Antarctic leader, he'd had a quitter and dealt with it in a similar way. And over the history of these sort of scenarios, you've had that happen. It's a human condition to act out and go, oh, I can't deal with it. I quit. And honestly, one person acted on it. Probably everyone had moments in their mind daydreaming it. And that was
being human.
That was to see how it played out. So that's always been a hard one for me to deal with after the fact of like, it's just this little mark of like, what happened there? And could you have predicted it? Should he have, is it a recruiting problem? And part of that then comes back to this sphere of control and a mantra that I kind of developed around. It doesn't matter if it's your fault or not. If it's your problem, deal with it. And there was a blame game to be had of like, well, who have they recruited here? What did we do in the lead up to this? How have I managed this in the run up to this? What about his supervisor and his peers and others that could have helped this or whatever? It doesn't freaking matter how we got here. We're here. We're dealing with it, and you can worry about it later, or not. And that's a real tough one for leaders. You're often only as good as your last decisions. In that you can sit around and stew about, if we'd done that, if we'd made this sale or this had happened. And
yes, as I do.
Yeah, and it's natural, but the sooner you can just accept it and learn from it and move on, not make the same mistake twice, not lament the missed opportunity. You'll find you won't miss the next opportunity. Now it might mean that today you didn't make money or you didn't sell widgets or whatever it is you do, but tomorrow you won't miss the next opportunity, which might be better, might be smaller, but you'll move forward.
And David, I'd love to know, so your leadership journey, where did that start in your life?
Yeah, it wasn't. I was never a kind of earmarked junior leader. Like I wasn't school captain or anything.
Neither.
It's funny how that's one great pathway, and certainly you meet some amazing, inspiring junior leaders, and you just go, "Geez, you're going places." I was never quite one of them. Socially, I'd always been a bit of a leader, and I think when I got to university, I was very actively involved in a lot of university clubs and societies, and ran a lot of events. Which it's not necessarily leadership, but it's sort of social leadership. So there's a lot of that, and then I joined the Australian Army Reserve whilst at uni, and that they selected me for officer training, and I went through that system, and that gave me a more rounded and wholesome sort of training framework of how to lead. And then the opportunities came up in later uni. I deferred and went on to full-time service with the Army, and then led a platoon over in the Solomon Islands back in 2007 on a peacekeeping mission, and that was my first real time in a leadership role.
Right.
As a pretty young infantry officer, but thoroughly enjoyed it. Loved, I guess, the power trip of being in command of a military
Yeah.
unit was always good, but also the other elements of just being part of the team, but also leading it and getting to set that culture and seeing how you feed it and drive that culture. And I heard
Mm.
I remember chatting to the commanding officer on that trip once, and he said, and so there's three Australian platoons, a Kiwi platoon, and some Tongans and Fijians, and a whole mishmash of other Pacific Island nations that were part of the mission. But there's these three core Australian platoons that were there, and the commanding officer he just sort of gave me this great summary. He's like, "Look, attitude of your platoons is a direct reflection of the leadership." And he's like, when I meet a soldier and chat to them for 5 seconds, I can tell which platoon they're in without having to ask or without consciously remembering their name, just based on the fact that after this long living and working together as different teams, there's elements of you in each of your soldiers, and there's elements of your other members in there, and that reflects as well around the other leadership structures and then the key personalities in those units. And I felt that was something great in terms of that unit cohesion, and then there was probably elements of my soldiers that rubbed off on me, and you become this organic little team. And I was really proud of that, to be like, wow, the fact that people are saying, oh, we couldn't recognize your platoon's vibe just on the conversation. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. And to this day, that team, like, we still run into each other. We still catch up on Anzac Days.
Great.
And it's a great camaraderie and a great kind of shared experience that you have. And your first trip is always your most memorable. I did multiple other trips to war zones in later years in different roles, and you have some great teams to go, but you never kind of beat that
quite
first
connect again. Yeah. And David, what would be your advice to someone who is trying to essentially be a better leader? Because I think, from my own experience, this is one thing I underestimated. As you said, or as your commander shared, the leader kind of rubs off on their team. If someone is trying to, I guess, step more into their power of being a leader, what would be your advice there for them?
Being authentic and being vulnerable and admitting where you don't know answers can be, it's a very hard one to do. And I'm often torn on it. I think there are moments where, as a leader, you do have to be blindly optimistic. Now, it doesn't mean you're naive, and it doesn't mean you're lying to your team, but perhaps you do have to be optimistic that that you're going for the best case scenario, and that the hope that that's going to happen, and giving them an avenue of like, we're going to achieve this by doing this. And it's setting that path, not like, oh, hey, I don't know if it's going to fail. So there's a difference between vulnerability and then actual kind of, being hopeless. And that's a tricky one. But I think being authentic and being comfortable with your own style, your leadership is an extension of your personality, but it's also separate, and separating your own ego and your own personality at times from leadership version of you and personal you. And then knowing that when to take feedback and being open to it, in that feedback isn't directed at you personally, it's directed at leadership you. And leadership you should always be on a journey of improvement. Now, personal you should be too, but they're slightly different. And so leadership you, if someone gives you feedback to say, hey, Dave, the way you said that, or the way you addressed this team was slightly condescending, or it was slightly know-it-all-y, or whatever it was, you go, well, yeah, because I know it all, or I know this topic, so I'm talking about it. And that's what, but you go, okay, wherever that feedback's coming from, it's coming from the fact that I've even fronted up to give it to you often means that multiple people have felt it, and they were the one that got voted to go and voice it.
Yeah.
And so then go, okay, that's not directed at me to say I am condescending. It's just to say, hey, the leadership version of me that just delivered that talk or whatever it was, or plan, came across as a bit condescending, and take that on board and go, okay. And now the audience might be different as well. I've always said this as well, in terms of leading the team you've got and the situation you face. And that means you have to change your style, because if you go, for me, for instance, if I went into the Australian Antarctic program and some of the voyages and teams I've led there, if you're running that like a military operation, it doesn't work. It might
No.
work a little bit, but it won't work because they're not soldiers. They're scientists, and they'll
Yeah.
just go they do their own thing, and you go, okay, that's
They
great.
will.
And yeah, they will, whoop, off they go. But then when you understand that, you go, okay, I'm leading scientists here who
Yeah.
they just need to know what the kind of limits are, and then they'll go, and that's fine. They don't need to be told what to do. They'll find stuff to do because they know what they're trying to do. They're trying to find moss or whatever it is, and they'll go. Just give them the left and right, and point them in the right direction and the equipment, and keep an eye on them. Off they go. And that's the same for business leaders then. If you're leading a big company, or you're leading a startup, or you're leading it's you and your EA that works part-time and your social manager, like that's it. If it's your, a lot of businesses starting out, it's you and your husband or your wife and your
family
kids
do.
and your family. And now how do you lead family? I mean, I find that to be they're the worst because your family just reverts to, well, your family. And then I find this hilarious. And my brother and I, who are quite similar personalities, but it still reverts back to a older brother, and I'm the younger brother. And so
I see
even
that dynamic.
Yeah, that dynamic just goes back to it, and you just go like, oh, okay, that's that. And that can be the hardest time. Whereas once you're fully established and you're at a big company or even medium-sized company that's got all the specialists, if you've got your CEO, you've got your deputies, you've got your ops managers, you've got your log and HR managers, etc. Then they all do their jobs, and it's easier. So I think the advice to those starting out is to really learn your style, be comfortable being uncomfortable in leadership roles, be comfortable being unpopular is another core element. But rolling with it and accepting that you chose to be a leader. Parts of that are ugly and unpopular and difficult, but that's what you chose, and just roll with that and keep moving forward.
And David, how do you navigate that uncomfort? Because it can be really, really extreme. I've experienced this, and sometimes it gets really, really tough. And, there's moments where I've wanted to tap out. But again, like you say, I remind myself, how do you navigate through that?
Yeah, I think you have to. I come back to just the fact that, okay, you chose this, you wanted this. And when that means you're getting either bad feedback or someone's quitting in the middle of an Antarctic winter, or you just, you feel like you're failing, or you go, okay, you've gone all in on, okay, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and that's going to lead to success. And then you don't even get past X, and you're like, oh, well, that didn't go well.
Yeah.
You just come up with the next plan and give the team the next plan and go, all right, today we didn't get off the start line, so tomorrow we wake up and we try and do the same thing again. And at the same time, not being too tied to a plan. What I love about the Antarctic trips, the more recent ones I've done, is leading deep field camps where you're out in the middle of nowhere, living in tents in minus 15, minus 20 degree temperature, and kind of it's just everything's freezing all the time. Even we used to have a joke, like even when we're inside, we're outside because you're inside a tent, but the olive oil is still frozen.
It's frozen. And you actually went back?
Oh yeah,
oh my
absolutely.
Gosh.
Yeah, multiple times. I think I've done seven trips now in total. So it's addictive. But the thing is about, like, how do you get yourself through it is not being too tied to your plan of going, all right, we wanted to do this, it didn't work for these reasons. We either try and do the same thing again because it was the weather or the market conditions or whatever it was that didn't work today or this week. So we're going to rinse and repeat the same thing with an adjustment, or that plan was fundamentally flawed. Now we know how not to do it. So let's go with the way to do it. And you see this with companies or anything, that if you're too tied to a plan that's not working without the ability to adapt, you're doomed. And you'll just, you might, and there's so many good examples of that in day-to-day life. Things like BlackBerry or Nokia. How did they have such big market share and then nothing? Physical copy Melways, like Lonely Planet, and like some of these things that were just fundamental parts of human existence, and in an Australian context of how do you but all of a sudden they just didn't adapt, or a competitor came along and took it. And how can you stay ahead of that and not be too tight? Oh, but what we're doing is working. You're like, yeah, but it's vulnerable to change. And
that's really a great point that you've mentioned. Even if you look at, the old VHS, and then, the DVD stores, and Netflix came along and completely disrupted that entire industry. And in the branding space, Canva's done that, design's now accessible to everyone. So it's really disrupted certain areas that we thought would never, ever change.
That's right. And you look at it and you go, how did, if say Blockbuster had been
Mm.
more adaptive when they had such market share of the
Yeah.
VHS and DVD rental sphere, and Netflix started as a DVD mail out service,
Yeah.
and you had to return them. That's how Netflix started. So
Mm.
essentially, they were a competitor to Blockbuster, but Blockbuster went, well, these guys are a mail out service. People will want to go to a video library and browse because that's how people do it.
Yeah.
And they could have invented Netflix, and it would have been a
Yes.
natural progression then of like, you'd now go like, oh, hey, what are you watching on Blockflix tonight?
Mm.
And that's something you go, hey, now look, I'm sure the people at Blockbuster at the executive level and everything are fine, but you look at it and go, well, that company, if they could have adapted, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Definitely. And David, I'd love to know, what is the bravest thing that you've done? I mean, you've had so many adventures and, high adrenaline sports and activities. What do you consider the bravest thing?
Look, but I mean, we've probably covered it enough. Is like the bravest decision is really having signed up to lead an Antarctic team who I essentially
Mm.
didn't know for
Mm.
12 months. But it was a decision I wouldn't necessarily say it is brave. I think it's brave of everyone in that team to sign up
Mm.
sight unseen to go down for a year with a bunch of people you don't know to a place most of us
Yeah.
hadn't spent much time. So that was pretty bold, but there's some time in Hobart to get to know everyone and do some training
Yeah.
beforehand as well. So you get a moment to work it out. I think the other brave one was when I got back after the year and a half and sailed into Fremantle, and you've been away for a year and a half, arrived back in mid 2021 in the middle of the pandemic when it's still in the kind of eye of the storm, and was faced then with the options of like, okay, do I just go back to what I was doing, or do I draw a line in the sand and go, I can now take everything I've learned and everything I've done, turn it into a business and a life-changing opportunity, which was okay, I'm going to write a book
Mm.
and I'm going to get out on the professional speaking circuit and tell this story, good and bad. And
Yeah.
that was the first time I'd really been out on my own. I'd always had the apparatus of being in the military or being at a government department or being in a business where I wasn't by myself. I'd always had that around me in that blanket or that comfort zone.
Mm.
And that was a pretty bold and risky move, but a calculated risk. There's a lot of, I love discussing risk and the way we look at it and the way people
Mm.
can be like, oh my God, you do dangerous things. You're like, dangerous things is where it's at. We do dangerous
Yeah.
things every day. We've created a world where we don't talk about them.
Yeah.
Or you're blissfully ignorant to the challenges or the risks around you. And so that was a big bold decision in 2021 to make that decision and go, all right. And now a couple of years later, the book sold nearly 20,000 copies.
Fantastic.
I've got a guy in Hollywood at the moment shopping it around to try and get us a movie deal or a Netflix
Oh,
deal.
good. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed for that. That's another strangely daunting business that, I mean, I'd had no business before in the publishing side of things. I'd never written a book
Mm.
before, so that was a bold new move into that space. And then now it's an even trickier contemplation of like, oh, how do you negotiate with Hollywood? What are your
Yes.
red lines of what you will and won't negotiate on?
And how have you found the whole experience of writing a book?
I loved it. I was
Mm.
chatting to another author yesterday who rang me up because he'd been given a copy of my book to help inspire him to write his book. I'm like, oh,
Oh, great.
I feel like I've leveled up in the author world when
Awesome. Congrats.
you're now the like experienced author that other authors call. I'm like,
Yeah. Very cool.
yeah, I loved it. I mean, look, in a lot of ways, you're writing a true story. So I didn't
Mhm.
have the challenges of trying to write the greatest fiction novel of all time.
Yeah.
But so first and foremost, I wrote the book for myself and the team to one extent, and also kind of my family and for history of like, okay, this is an interesting, unique scenario that we were in. So I'm just going to write that book. And
Mhm.
the first version of it, the first draft was very factual, very clinical of like, I did this and then this and then this and this. And there was no real characters to it and there was no emotion. So then
Right.
it went from there, and I had a coach who helped me develop that, and then some test readers like my brother and sister and family and some other randoms that I met along the way who were interested and said, hey, and including one who was the girl that worked at Officeworks where I used to get it
Mm.
printed, and she read it and she said, oh,
Oh.
wrote you a book review on your book. So that was great.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah, that was lovely of it. And so there were sort of those things that I quite enjoyed doing it and learning that new process and seeing where it took me. And I think there's a lot of authors that go into writing books, for all sorts of different reasons. Some people just write a book because they're like, I don't know, I just thought I'd write this story to self-publish or not even published. And I was going into it with it had an objective and a business plan of like, okay, this book, whilst it needs to tell the story, it's also got to be a good book and commercially viable. So we had to change elements or tweak bits. And I remember chatting to the publisher about this and the team at Affirm Press who did a great job helping me along the way. But they very much saw it as this kind of like Jack Ryan goes to Antarctica scenario. And I'm like, oh God, like I know what you mean. Like I know what you want this book to be, and I'll give you elements of that. But yeah, just great. But that's Hollywood, or that's publishing, and you've got to make something that people want to read. So that's how from that first draft, and I like that process, and I found that to be quite fun. And there's frustrating moments, but when the editors kind of tell you to go back to stuff that was already in there, and you're like, but we took that out.
Yeah, it's a bit of back and forth.
Yeah, a bit of that.
Yeah. And I think it's great how you've captured that moment in time, like forever. I mean, even like this podcast, it's great to have you on. You've captured that moment. And, you spoke of someone from 100 years ago, had a similar experience on an expedition. I think it's brave, but it's also fantastic that you captured that.
Yeah, and I got asked the other day of like, okay, now the book's been out for a couple of years now, and on the sort of 5th or 6th print run. And we haven't changed it. There's a few typos that people write in, and people love writing and be like, oh, page 332. There's a split infinitive, and you're like, mate, I don't care.
Oh my gosh.
Well, yeah,
one way to build an audience, right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, like, well, yeah, good for you. Get your red pen out and fix it. And I really appreciate those. Anyone that's fixed up any other typos, let me know. We try and take them out every time, but we haven't changed anything. And I got asked like, oh, would you? Now it's been a couple of years. Would you change it? And there's a couple of little stories here and there that I think I go, oh, I regret that I didn't put that in. But I'm like, oh, I could go back and add that in now. But I also go, no, it's a snapshot of where my head was at in 2021, fresh off the boat. That's the story I wrote then. I wouldn't change it drastically. There'd be a couple of tiny things where I'm like, oh, maybe I'd add in a bit more here or a bit more there. But at the same time, then I think you're messing with it. And I'm not a fan of kind of revisionist history in terms of, if something was written then, that's how it was published, don't change it. And that's why I like physical copies of books and physical CDs and some of that stuff. You're like, that's how it was written back then. That's how it is. And I used to remember when I was living in South Asia, they used to have these great bookstores that had I think they were reprints. They certainly weren't first editions, but reprints, word for word, of like Victorian era exploration of British India and the Raj and this sort of dynasty. And they were just so raw. And now a lot of it was pretty racist by modern standards and culturally inappropriate. Yeah, you go. It gives you a primary source in the head of, okay, that's what a 1800s kind of explorer thought of this region, and you go, great, I know that now. Yep, if you brought him along to dinner today, he would be cancelled straight away. But that's part of it. Like, there's nothing inherently racist in my book or anything. But you go about it's written in 2021.
Yeah, of course, it was their perspective.
That was my perspective in 2021. It hasn't changed too much, but maybe in 100 years they'll go, oh, hey, that's now out of date, and you never know.
And David, is there anything that you... No, it's fine. I love it. Is there anything that you fear in life, being so courageous and driven?
Yeah, got a fear of failure, and I think that motivates you pretty well. It certainly keeps me going at times. You go, don't want to fail here. Want to be successful. Want to be liked, and we've all got those elements. They're what make us human, and they keep you going because you go, oh, I've got to do this. You got your reputation and those things. So they're my biggest fears. I'm always motivated. I love a good deadline. I feel like if I've got the kind of benefit of time, I'm like, oh, I'll just get distracted and do other things until,
Same.
oh my God, you've got 20 minutes. I'm like, great.
Yes.
I'll work hard for 20 minutes. But if they're like, oh,
Yeah.
you got 6 months to do this. I'm like, oh, I'll do it.
Yeah.
I'll do it in 5 months.
Yeah.
I'll do it in 5 months time. And then in the preceding time, I'll just go take a holiday. So
Yeah.
that's a funny one.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that's okay. So with the expedition, besides the obvious challenge of COVID, was there any other challenges that arose during that time?
Yeah, we had two other major ones that really threw a curveball to us, and that was that. So just before Christmas 2020, when we'd been there for over a year, we were shaping up to the run to the finish line. We sort of knew how we were going to get home. They'd chartered another ship that was going to come and get us early 2021. So we still had a couple of months to run. We had an incident where the doctor kind of came into my office and said, hey, we've got a critical issue we've got to deal with one of the team, and we've got to evacuate them back to Australia, or they need some treatment that we can't offer them here. And that just meant everything stopped in terms of, all right, we now need to focus on how do we evacuate someone back to Australia, which obviously there wasn't any open logistic chain at the time. So, and it increased the number of other risks to do a medical evacuation. But we were able to use Chinese and American aviation assets to support ourselves and evacuate that member. And then also we put the bloke that had spectacularly quit earlier.
Oh, that tapped out. Yeah.
We put him on the plane. Or he volunteered to jump on the plane as well. So there was an element of a silver lining with that medical evacuation, but that was something that gave us a really clear focus. Was at a time when we were all pretty mentally and emotionally exhausted from the scenario, but we went, all right, we've got to do this. We've got to get this guy home. There's no option here, and failure is not an option in that scenario. If it had failed, it would have been very, very grim. And so we did that, and that got us through to the end of 2020, which then we celebrated in style and thought we were home and hosed. And we had one final lesson on the voyage home, which was the ultimate example of just it's not over till it's over. When, at this point, we'd been away for over 500 days. We're on a ship on the way home, halfway across the Southern Ocean, and on our way to Hobart when disaster struck, and the ship had a catastrophic explosion in one of the engine rooms, and a massive fireball erupted, and the ship was on fire. So we had to all muster, go to the emergency room, and stand by the lifeboats, get ready to abandon ship as the crew and a number of others jumped on fire hoses, put the fire out, and were eventually able to actually even get the ship back under control and get the one remaining engine operational again, and limp the ship into Fremantle because it was slightly closer than Hobart from where we were in the Southern Ocean. So it was this nail in the coffin of just
the final
ridiculousness.
one,
The final chapter, and it's the final chapter of the book of just, it's just when you think it's over is when your ship explodes, and you go, all right, let's and I remember clearly at those points looking around and chatting to the team, just going, well, after everything we've been through, to have been away for this long, through all the highs and lows, of course, we're going to jump on lifeboats and abandon ship in the middle of the ocean, and that's how this ends.
And that's what you guys had to do?
Well, we didn't have to get on the lifeboats. It was pretty close, but we thankfully did get the ship going again, and it suffered some very critical damage. But credit to the crew and the team, and a number of my team that jumped on the hoses and jumped in at the front of the response to that.
Yeah.
And that was another one that just made the story, and there was nothing about that particular year that individually hadn't happened before. It just hadn't all happened under a pandemic to one team in such a condensed period of time. And there was another book that came out just before we'd left that covered the 30-year history of the ice-breaking ship that we were on, the Aurora Australis, that had been in service since the early 90s and through to 2019. And that book almost, in 30 years covers the same sort of stuff that we had to do in terms of
you guys,
rescue missions and fires and emergencies and all these things that happens over. It does happen, but it doesn't all happen in a year
like it did to you guys. Yeah,
which it's just part of it's bad luck, but part of it's fate, and that's what you want. And I find that to be something interesting, that you want to be a leader, and you want success, but also a lot of success in leadership will come from incredibly difficult challenges that
Mm.
no one wants to hear from the CEO of a company that's listed, share price is good, board are happy, shareholders are
Yeah.
happy, and it's doing, different mergers and it's just whatever, it's fine, it's booming.
Mm.
They want to hear from like the first CEO or the CEO that pulled it out of the doldrums when it got sold for 10 cents on the share. They came in to fix it, and that was
Yeah.
it. And they turned it around. They invented Netflix out of the dust of Blockbuster or something.
Mm.
They're your stories. So I think that was part of it for me, and then even the whole team of go, well, yeah, if you'd just done another routine year in Antarctica, that's great, amazing, and people love hearing about
100%.
it. But
Yeah.
when you can tell a story like ours to say, hey, yeah, we were there during the pandemic, and people go, oh wow, that's different. You're like, yeah, well, that's only
Yeah.
the start of it. So
Completely. And how do you feel that experience has really, shaped your life, David?
I think it aged me in some ways. Like I'm now
Oh,
much,
really?
yeah, I think I'm much more retrospective, and I almost feel at times I could relate better to a 60 or 70-year-old than people my own age.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh.
No, yeah, no, it's kind of
Ah.
weird. If I always feel and even with other leadership opportunities that come up, and someone was chatting to me about this the other night, like, oh,
Hmm.
this opportunity would come up, and you'd be in charge of this, and I'm like, I have zero interest in that.
Yeah.
And they're like, but you, and I'm like, yeah, I know. There was a time where I would love that, but
Yeah.
now, and not in a just like I don't want to do. Like I'd absolutely do it if I
Hmm.
wanted to, but it was more like I don't want to take up a spot that someone else who hasn't had an opportunity to lead in that particular scenario. I don't
Mm.
want to take their seat. Like I feel like I've had enough. There was times where I'd set out and I wanted leadership challenges and all that sort of stuff, but I'm now going through a phase of I want different challenges. I want
Yeah.
to look at different aspects, and I've done the kind of government style leadership in war zones and embassies and in Antarctica. I'm like, I've done enough of that. I've done enough adventure leadership. Let's have a look at other things. Running my own little small business of running the
Yeah.
speaking and book sales, and we were talking about that before we started. Of just now having to
Mm.
navigate that is a challenge, and I'm certainly not leading a big team. I've got me and a part-time EA, and that's
Mm.
it. And yet you've got to manage stock and bookings and travel and
So much.
margins of what's worth it, what's not worth it, and then time becomes a factor. And it's much harder. I found that to be the biggest challenge now, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners relate to this.
Yes.
Of when you're running your own business and you got to take a holiday, you're like, well, what do you
Yeah.
mean a holiday? Like that's gonna hurt. Not only will I not do any events that week, but I also won't be booking other events because I'm not
Mm-mm.
taking, I'm not answering the phone, I'm not checking emails, and so you just end up working all the time, and that's not
Yeah.
healthy either. And I'm enjoying that challenge, and it's been a frustrating thing now. There was a delay in the latest shipment of books, which has cost me sales, and I'm like, oh, this is things just trying to balance like warehousing how many books you've got, how many the publisher's holding, people emailing saying, hey, I want to buy hundreds of copies of your book. None of the distributors have got them. No bookstores have got them. Have you got them? I'm like, I don't. I'm waiting on them as
Yeah.
well. And
How
they go,
frustrating.
oh, but we wanted you to come to this event and sell 100 books to everyone that's there. And you go,
Mm.
so that's been a frustrating thing. And again, it's out of your control. You're like, I'd
Yeah.
ordered the books, they didn't get shipped, don't have them. So
Yeah.
yeah, what
Not
do you
much you can
do? And
do.
other than you go, great problem to have, has been my attitude to the lack of stock. But anyone
Yeah.
listening to this podcast, books should be back in stock, in all major outlets, online,
Right.
and if you can't get one through any of those, just send me an email and I had it on my website for a while to have signed books, but the problem was that I hadn't started selling too many, and it was hard to kind of process
Ah, I
those orders.
see.
So yeah,
We'll
which
definitely
again
pop
was
the link
good
in the
problem
show
to
notes
have.
as well.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you. I was going to say we'll definitely pop the link in the show notes as well. Should anyone wish to purchase your book. David,
Right.
what is next for you in terms of you've got your business? Any other adventures planned?
Yeah, so toying with politics is the next one.
Hmm.
Just sort of looking at the options there. I don't want to announce anything or say anything
No, that's
on this
fine.
one, but yeah, there's a few things in the works there.
Great.
It's probably been on the cards, even though I haven't been willing to admit it for a while. That's been a
Hmm.
natural progression, and that'll be the next thing that you'll see my face in.
Yeah, and that's where you feel called?
Just feel there's a lot. I mean, it's the reason I've stayed away from it, and to change tune a little bit. Like, politics has become so divisive and
Mm.
jumbled, and I feel like I think Australian politics in particular has become much more partisan. And yet, even then, a lot of the parties have got identity problems and factional. There's always been factions in the major parties, and
Mm.
there's always been a third party. Or there's been periods of time where we've had the Democrats and now the Greens and the Teals. We've always had and toyed with what is the balance. Is it independent? Is it a party? Is it a movement? And it's so hard to navigate where to put yourself. And that's been my other challenge now, is to go, okay, so I've obviously I've had a great opportunity to understand and be involved in climate science and climate research down in Antarctica, and seen climate change, well, proof of it through data and through science, and it's hard to see with your own eyes. I think that's I'd hold short of saying that directly, because I've only been there, a few times in the last few years, and yet there are certainly the data and the scientists I've worked with. You can see the evidence there. And so people go, oh, the Greens would love you. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't know if I'm aligned with them on a lot of other policies. And they go, oh, but you could join the Liberal Party and you'd have, strong climate change things. I'm like, but I don't think they're a party that's willing to embrace some of those. So you're torn, and you go, well, where do you find yourself? And I'm like, but I don't necessarily. There's elements of things in the Labor Party. You go, oh, I could see myself in these elements of there, but you go, but then not on this and not on that. And so that's the hard one, is you go, I know I'd feel like I could bring a lot to the political landscape at any level in Australia. But once you then brushed with, oh, you're a member of this party, they're like, oh yeah, he's there. Oh, that's what he is. And rather than that's who you are. And or you can even adapt and learn and change. I think that's something that becomes the scrutiny on politicians now. Like, oh, well, back at university, this person was here they are protesting against this, and you're like, yeah, mate, they're now 50 and the world's changed. Now, there's some things that are fairly unforgivable if you're out there saying, like, but it's still a case of, well, how can we not allow politicians and individuals to grow and learn as society change? Because there were views and opinions that you would have had, weeks, months, years ago. And I find that funny as well, because Peter Costello had been the editor-in-chief of the Monash University student newspaper back in the day as well. It was very left-leaning and everything back then. And for him to have been and then a very prominent Liberal leader and everything as well was an interesting change to see how one, he'd gone from, I don't know too much about his actual political leanings when he was a university student, but certainly having been the head of that newspaper, which was very left-leaning and certainly very, very political, was an interesting one to be like, oh, there you go. That's why he ended up.
Yeah,
Shout out
definitely.
To Pete if he's listening.
Hopefully. David, what are some other ways business owners can engage you besides your book?
So I'm a professional speaker out on the circuit. If you head to my website and send me an inquiry, and I do work through Saxton Speakers as well, who are Australia's biggest speaking agency. They represent me, and they do a great job kind of managing all of that. So if you're keen to have me along to your school or business or event, just send us a link through my website or through Saxton Speakers, and love to come along and do it. And I've actually really preferred doing workshops. So I love doing keynotes and telling the story, and that's great. But if an opportunity comes up and they say, hey, come in, work with our junior leadership group or our emerging leaders, or I do a lot of stuff with boards and CEOs as well, to actually go in. And what I love there is then putting you in the scenarios I was in, to say, okay, so here we are. You're in the middle of an Antarctic winter. Here's the scene. Here's the vibe. Here are the parameters. And then bang, here's your problem. What are you doing? How are you going to manage that? How are you going to manage yourself? How are you going to manage your team? So that's the stuff I love doing really passionately. And so if you're out there and you're interested in some professional development training for yourself or your team, give us a shout and I'll come along.
And do those workshops run for a day or two or longer?
Up to you. The shortest I've done would be a day. Half day is pushing it. Can be done, but you kind of only get to one case study and that'd be it. So full day, I think, 2 to 3 days is then starting. 2 days about right. 1 to 2 days, depending on the size of your teams. And it depends. Yeah. It depends. Give us a call. and have a chat, and I'll work with what your company need.
Great. As I mentioned before, we'll definitely pop all those links in the show notes as well. David, before we sign off, any final words of wisdom for the business owners out there?
Take risks, back yourself, learn from your failures, and embrace the chaos. That would be it. If I could put that on a t-shirt, I should.
You should.
Yeah.
We can brand it for you.
That's right. Thanks. Yeah. Perfect.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you so much. What were you going to say?
I was going to say thanks for having me on, and good luck to all those business owners and listeners out there.
Yeah, thank you, David. I really appreciate you setting time aside to be on the show. And thank you so much for all that you've shared and for being brave and putting your book out there. And as a business owner, from one business owner to another, putting yourself out there as well. It's great to see. And I look forward to seeing you in the politics side of things as well.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me on, and have a good day.
Thanks. You too. Take care.